What if the person you promised never to love became the one you couldn't live without? It began on a winter morning that felt colder than truth itself. The city was wrapped in a hush, the kind that only comes before something shatters. Steam rose from the streets like breath from a sleeping giant, and inside a glass tower that touched the low gray clouds, two strangers shook hands over a contract that would change both their lives. He was a man of order, a name that made journalists whisper. Billionaire, strategist, a mind sharpened by solitude and war-room negotiations. To him, emotion was a liability, love a storm that left empires in ruins. He didn't believe in chaos, only in control. She, on the other hand, was chaos wrapped in calm. Lila Hart, once a painter, now a survivor of her own broken dreams. She wasn't supposed to be there that morning, not in that office, not in his world. But life, as she often said, had a way of pushing people toward the wrong doors at the right time. Their meeting was not romantic, it was calculated, a business proposition dressed in civility. Elias needed a public partner, marriage of convenience to steady his empire against a brewing scandal. She needed stability, something to anchor her after years of drifting between cities, debts, and faded canvases. Their deal was simple, a year-long arrangement. No intimacy, no emotion, no questions, a cold agreement. But fate, as always, hides its fire beneath the ice. When they signed, she noticed the tremor in his hand, barely perceptible, but real. A man who never trembled, never faltered, and he noticed the way she didn't look away from it. No curiosity, no pity, just understanding. For a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them, something neither contract nor logic could account for. The wedding was silent. No vows, just signatures. Cameras flashed, champagne sparkled, and gossip swirled like smoke. To the world, it was a union of power and poise. But behind the glass smiles, two strangers stood beside each other, both aware of the hollow space between them. Their first night as husband and wife was spent in different rooms. He worked late, as always. She painted not because she wanted to, but because the walls felt too white, too empty. Her brush moved without thought, streaks of red, gray, and gold colors she hadn't used in years. At dawn, he found her asleep on the couch, paint smeared across her hands like war paint. The canvas leaned against the window, catching the first light of day. He stared at it for a long time. It was chaos, wild, defiant, alive, the opposite of everything he believed in, yet he couldn't look away. Days turned into weeks. Their lives ran parallel, never touching but always aware of the other's presence. She learned the rhythms of his world, the sound of his pen scratching across paper, the way he paused before making a decision, the rare quiet sighs that escaped him when no one was listening. He learned hers too, the way she hummed when she cooked, the scent of turpentine that followed her through the halls, the music she played late at night, old jazz records that crackled like fire in the dark. There was no romance. Not yet. Just a strange, delicate balance to people bound by an agreement, orbiting each other like wary stars. But every balance is doomed to break. It happened one evening in March, during a storm that clawed at the city. He was returning from a dinner meeting when he saw the lights flickering in their apartment. Inside, water had leaked through the ceiling, drenching her studio. Her paintings lay ruined on the floor, colors bleeding together in surrender. She stood in the middle of it all, motionless, eyes hollow. For the first time, he saw her not as a convenience but as someone breaking. He crossed the room, removed his jacket, and began picking up the canvases one by one. She told him to stop. He didn't. He gathered them gently, stacking them against the wall, hands stained in blue and red. When he finally looked up, she was crying not from sadness, but disbelief. "Why are you helping me?" she whispered. He didn't know. He only said, "Because no one helped me when my world fell apart." Something shifted that night. The silence between them changed shape. It became heavier, charged with something unspoken. The next morning they shared breakfast together for the first time. He made coffee. She made toast. It was awkward but warm, like two strangers pretending to be human again. Weeks passed. The cold agreement began to thaw. She started leaving her brushes out in the open. He stopped locking his office door. Little by little, their worlds bled into each other. One night, he found her in the study, reading an old book of poetry. She didn't notice him watching. She read aloud, softly, as if confessing to the air. "I have loved to the point of madness. That which is called madness. That which to me is the only sensible way to love." When she turned, their eyes met. He didn't speak. He just walked closer slowly, deliberately, and placed his hand on the back of the chair she sat in. The air trembled. She didn't move. It would have been easy to cross that line. But he didn't. Instead, he whispered, "You shouldn't read things like that." "Why not?" she asked. "Because some words have teeth," he said, "and they bite when you least expect it." After that night, things changed in ways neither of them admitted. Every glance lingered too long. Every accidental touch carried the weight of something forbidden. Their cold agreement had become dangerous. By summer, the facade of formality began to crack. Gossip returned. Rumors spread of jealousy, of affection, of passion behind closed doors. He ignored them, but she couldn't. For her, it wasn't just a contract anymore. It was something she couldn't name without trembling. The turning point came at a charity gala. She wore red, not the soft kind, but crimson, the color of defiance. When she walked down the marble staircase, every head turned, including his. Throughout the night, their eyes kept finding each other. Across crowded rooms, through laughter and polite conversation, something magnetic pulled them closer. Later, in the quiet corridor behind the ballroom, she confronted him. "Why do you keep looking at me like that?" she asked. He took a breath, his voice low. "Careful. Because you look like a mistake I want to make again." The air thickened. The sound of distant music faded. For a moment it felt as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. But before either could move, a camera flash went off. A journalist, lurking in the shadows. The next morning their photo was on every tabloid front page. The coldest man in business caught in a moment of heat. The scandal erupted. Board members called for explanations. Investors panicked. What had started as a controlled arrangement was now chaos. He tried to fix it the only way he knew, by retreating, by closing the distance between them again. But she refused to go back to the cold. "You said this was business," she told him one night, standing in the doorway of his office. "But you don't look at me like a business decision anymore." He said nothing. "Tell me this was all a lie." She demanded. "That you feel nothing." Silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know how to feel anymore." She left before he could stop her. The next morning her studio was empty, the walls bare. Only one painting remained, the one she made the night they first met. The wild, chaotic one. On the back, she'd written 4 words. "Cold turns to fire." He stared at it for a long time. The storm outside the window mirrored the one inside him. For the first time in years he felt something break, something real. The world would later call it a scandal, a disaster, a failure of control. But to him, it was something else entirely. A beginning disguised as an ending. Weeks passed before he heard from her again. A letter, no return address. In it, only a single line. "Some agreements are meant to be broken." He folded the letter, tucked it into his pocket, and walked out of the glass tower that had defined him for years. Where he was going, no one knew. But the air outside was different, warmer, almost alive. Because sometimes, the coldest arrangements hide the fiercest flames. And sometimes, what begins as an act of control ends as a confession of the heart. But the question remained when he finally found her again. What would he say? Would he choose the safety of silence, or the fire that could burn them both? The answer waited just beyond the horizon, where reason ends and love begins. The road out of the city was long, lined with flickering streetlights that seemed to bow under the weight of the fog. Elias drove without knowing where he was going, only that every mile between him and that tower felt like shedding a layer of armor he hadn't realized he was still wearing. The letter rested in the passenger seat, folded and creased from being opened too many times. "Some agreements are meant to be broken." The words played in his head like an unfinished melody. Somewhere out there she was free painting again, perhaps, or hiding behind a new name. And for the first time, he didn't have a plan. The man who built empires with precision was now chasing ghosts. He ended up in a small coastal town, a place where no one knew his face or the headlines that had followed him. The sea was wild there, untamed, crashing against black rocks as though arguing with the earth itself. He rented a modest house overlooking the cliffs. Every morning he walked to the edge, watching the horizon bleed into shades of gray and blue. At night, he read her letter again, and then again, until the paper began to feel like skin, until her words began to sound like a heartbeat. One afternoon, he wandered into a local gallery, a quiet space filled with light and silence. The walls were lined with paintings, waves, skies, storms captured in motion. He almost turned to leave when he saw it. In the far corner, half shadowed by the window, hung a canvas that stopped him cold. It was hers, the same wild strokes, the same fevered color, the chaos he once couldn't understand. Beneath the signature was a small note, LH, the fire agreement. He stood there for a long time, the world narrowing to the sound of the sea outside and the echo of his own heartbeat. The gallery owner, an older woman with silver hair and paint-stained hands, approached him quietly. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. She brought it in months ago, never stayed long enough to talk much. But she said it was about someone who mistook silence for safety. Elias didn't reply. He didn't trust his voice. The woman smiled faintly. "If you're looking for her, she lives near the cliffs, small cottage, red door, hard to miss." He hesitated. Part of him wanted to turn back, to leave her untouched in memory, perfect and untarnished. But something deeper pulled him forward, the same something that had burned quietly beneath the ice since the moment they met. The cottage stood alone at the edge of the cliffs, weather-beaten but alive. The red door was exactly as described, its paint peeling in the salt air. He knocked once, twice, no answer. He was about to leave when he heard a soft thud inside, followed by the shuffle of footsteps. The door opened. She stood there, framed by the light behind her, paint on her hands again, hair tied loosely, eyes sharper than he remembered. Time hadn't dulled, hurt had carved her into something truer. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then, quietly, "You found me. I wasn't looking for anyone else," he said. She stepped aside, and he entered. The air inside smelled of turpentine, sea salt, and something floral. The walls were covered with paintings, dozens of them, some dark and stormy, others radiant. He noticed one in particular, unfinished, standing on an easel by the window. It was different, softer. He turned to her. "You left without saying goodbye. I didn't think you'd come after me," she replied. "I didn't think I would either." She smiled faintly, almost sad. "So what happens now? You tell me you've changed, that you're ready to feel." "I don't know what I'm ready for," he said, "but I know I'm done pretending I don't care." For a long time, she said nothing. The sea roared beyond the window, filling the silence between them. Finally, she walked toward the unfinished canvas. "You know," she murmured, "I once believed passion could fix anything, but passion burns. It doesn't heal. And yet you still paint with fire," he said, "because it's the only way I remember I'm alive." He stepped closer, his reflection merging with hers in the glass. "Then let it burn. Just this once." Her breath caught a flicker of something fierce in her eyes, but then she turned away. "You don't know what you're asking for, Elias. You built your world on control. You break things you can't understand." "I'm trying to understand now," he said softly. Her shoulders tensed, then relaxed. "You think you're the only one who got hurt?" she asked. "That contractual rules your distance. It didn't just keep me safe. It made me disappear. I painted until my hands bled, trying to find the person I was before you." He looked around the room, at the dozens of paintings, each one a fragment of her heart. "And did you find her?" Her gaze softened. "Maybe, but she's not who she was. And neither are you." The conversation drifted into quiet. The sea outside raged harder now, wind rattling the windows. He noticed how she stared into it, as if searching for something far beyond sight. Finally, she said, "Do you still have it? The painting I left behind?" "I never let it go," he answered, a faint smile. "Then you understand. Some fires aren't meant to die." That night, he didn't leave. They talked for hours about the scandal, the loneliness, the weight of expectations, about how two people could destroy each other simply by pretending they couldn't feel. The air between them changed again, softer now, edged with memory and what-ifs. When dawn broke, she was asleep on the couch and he stood by the window, watching the horizon blaze gold. He realized he hadn't seen sunlight this beautiful in years. For the first time, he allowed himself to hope. But life, as always, doesn't grant peace without testing it. Days turned into weeks. They began to rebuild something fragile but real. He helped her set up a studio by the cliffs, away from the sea spray. She began teaching local children how to paint. He started writing against his reflections, pieces of himself he'd buried under numbers and deals. It was almost ordinary. Almost. Then one morning, the gallery owner came to visit, carrying a newspaper. She placed it on the table wordlessly. The headline cut through the calm like a blade. Varan Industries faces collapse. Insider leak exposes financial scandal. Elias felt the room tilt. The empire he'd walked away from was crumbling, and worse, someone had traced him here. Lila saw the fear in his eyes. "You have to go back," she said quietly. "No," he replied. That world is yours, whether you want it or not," she interrupted. "You can't hide from it, Elias, not forever." The storm outside grew louder, echoing the one inside. He turned away, fists clenched. "Every time I reach for peace, something burns." She approached him slowly, placing a hand on his arm. "Maybe peace was never meant for people like us," she said. "Maybe we're meant to live in the fire." He looked at her then, the woman who had once been a transaction. Now the only truth he couldn't calculate. "Come with me," he said. Her hand trembled. "If I do, we lose this. The quiet, the light. You'll go back to fighting shadows and I'll vanish into them." "Then don't vanish," he whispered. "Stay where I can find you." She hesitated. The sea wind pushed through the door, scattering papers and sketches across the floor. Among them, the unfinished painting toppled from the easel face down. She knelt to pick it up, but the canvas had split down the center. Her eyes filled with something he couldn't name. "Everything we build keeps breaking." He knelt beside her, his hand brushing hers. "Then maybe breaking is the point," he said. "Maybe it's how we start again." They stayed like that for a long time, two people surrounded by fragments of art, of life, of choices that refused to be undone. The next morning, he packed a small bag. She didn't try to stop him. On the porch, under the soft light of dawn, they stood facing each other. "If you go," she said, "don't go to fix what's gone. Go to prove that you can live without walls." He nodded. "And if I fail, then find me again," she said, her voice breaking just slightly. "And we'll burn what's left." He drove away, the red door shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was just a dot against the cliffs. The road curved inland, swallowing him back into the world he thought he'd escaped. Back in the city, chaos awaited headlines, boardrooms, betrayal. He faced it all with a strange calm. The man who once feared losing control had already lost the one thing that made control matter. But something in him had changed. He no longer spoke in numbers but in truths. When journalists asked where he'd been, he said simply, "Learning to feel again." Months passed. The scandal burned itself out. The empire survived, smaller, leaner, but alive. And Elias Varan disappeared once more, this time without headlines. Far from the city, the wind swept over the cliffs, carrying with it a single whisper from the sea, a sound that might have been his name, or maybe just memory playing tricks on the air. In the small cottage, the red door swung open. Lila stood at the window, brush in hand, painting a new canvas. This one was calmer still fire, but a steady one. A flame that didn't destroy, only warmed. And far away, on a train heading north, Elias opened his wallet. Inside, folded neatly beside her letter, was a photograph of the unfinished painting they'd once broken together. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, smiled. Because some fires don't end in ashes, they end in light. But light, too, can cast shadows, and somewhere beyond that horizon, the next chapter of their story waited, already burning. The train cut through the fog like a blade through silk, its low hum blending with the steady rhythm of the rails. Elias watched the landscape pass in smears of gray and green. The world outside caught between seasons, not quite winter, not yet spring. He liked that in-between state. It mirrored the space he now occupied, suspended between what he had been and what he could become. He wasn't running this time. He told himself that. He was searching, though he couldn't say for what. The letter in his pocket, worn soft from months of unfolding, no longer felt like a message. It felt like a map. When the train slowed into a quiet northern town, he stepped onto the platform with no plan but a strange certainty that this was where he needed to be. The air tasted of pine and smoke. Somewhere nearby, a church bell tolled, slow and distant. He followed the sound through narrow streets until he reached a small bookstore tucked between two shuttered cafes. Inside, the world changed. Dust danced in shafts of light. Old pages whispered their stories in silence, and behind the counter sat a woman with dark curls tied loosely, humming a familiar tune. For a moment, his breath caught. It wasn't Lila, but something about the way she looked up, startled and unguarded, felt like her echo. "Can I help you?" she asked. He hesitated. "I'm looking for a book," he said finally. Something about beginnings. Her eyes softened with a kind of understanding that didn't need words. "Aren't we all?" she murmured, and disappeared among the shelves. He wandered the aisles, fingers brushing the spines of novels, biographies, collections of poetry. Then something stopped him, a canvas propped against the back wall, half hidden behind a stack of boxes. It wasn't for sale, but it was hers. Lila's brushwork was unmistakable, raw, deliberate, alive. The painting showed a figure standing before a sea of fire, not consumed by it, but illuminated. Beneath it, faint but clear, was a single inscription: "The one who leaves also returns." He touched the frame gently, his heart pounding. The woman behind the counter noticed. "You know her," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he answered. "I thought I did." The woman studied him as if deciding whether to share something. "She was here once," she said. "Stayed in the hills for a while. Said she was waiting for a letter that never came." He felt the words land like stones. "When last spring." Then one day she just left like smoke. He closed his eyes. He had sent no letters. He had told himself she didn't want them. But now he wondered what silence had cost. When he stepped outside, the bell was tolling again. Snow began to fall, slow and deliberate, each flake melting against his coat before it could settle. He thought of the red door, of her voice, of the way she had said, "Find me again." That night, he sat in a small inn, unable to sleep. The fireplace hissed softly, its flames painting gold onto the walls. He pulled out the letter, the old one, the only one, and for the first time, noticed something he hadn't before. The bottom corner was slightly thicker, like two pages pressed together. Carefully, he peeled them apart. There, written faintly beneath the first message, was another line. It must have been smudged in haste. The ink faded almost to nothing. "When the fire finds the sea, you'll know where I am." He stared at it, heart quickening. A riddle, a promise, or both. The next morning, he found himself at the edge of the northern cliffs, where the sea met the horizon like a blade meeting its sheath. The waves were violent, tearing at the rocks below. He stood there for a long time, searching the endless gray for meaning, until he noticed a figure in the distance, a lone fisherman, hauling nets near the shore. Elias climbed down toward him, boots sliding on wet stone. The man looked up as he approached, his face weathered but kind. "You're far from home," the fisherman said. "So are most people who are lost," Elias replied. The old man chuckled. "You looking for someone?" "Yes," he said. "A woman, an artist. She lived here. Maybe months ago." The fisherman's eyes narrowed in thought. "Ah, the painter by the cove." He pointed toward a path that wound along the cliffs. "She came here often. Said the sea reminded her of someone she used to know, left something behind." I think Elias followed the path, the wind sharp against his face. It led to a secluded cove, a place of still water tucked between black cliffs, hidden from view unless you knew where to look. There, in the hollow of a rock, he found it, a small box wrapped in cloth, protected from the weather. Inside, a folded sketch. The drawing was simple, two hands reaching toward each other, not touching, separated by a thin line of flame. On the back was a date, 1 month from that day, a date in the future. It wasn't a memory, it was a meeting. He stayed by the cove until the light died. The sea hissed against the rocks like a secret too heavy to tell. Somewhere deep inside, something When the day finally came, he returned at dawn. The sky was overcast, a low mist coiling across the water. He waited, unsure if the world would keep its promise. Then, through the fog, a figure appeared, walking along the shoreline, barefoot, her dress caught by the wind. Lila, she stopped when she saw him, disbelief flickering across her face. Then something else, relief, maybe, or something beyond it. "You found the message," she said, voice carried by the wind. "I found more than that," he replied. They stood facing each other, the space between them smaller than memory but heavier than time. "I thought you'd forgotten," she said. "I tried," he admitted. "It didn't work." She smiled faintly. "So what now? Another beginning?" He shook his head. "No, just truth." And then he told her everything about the letter he hadn't read fully. The life he'd tried to rebuild, the nights haunted by the thought of her still painting by the sea. She listened quiet, her eyes searching his face as though reading a language she'd once known but forgotten. When he finished, she stepped closer. "You always came back to the fire," she said softly, "even when it burned you." "Because it was never the fire I feared," he said. "It was what came after the light." For a moment, the world seemed to pause, just the waves, the wind, and them. Then she reached out, brushing her fingers against his hand. It wasn't passion. It wasn't reunion. It was something deeper, recognition. They spent the day walking the coastline, talking about everything and nothing. She told him she had left the cottage because the silence had grown too heavy. He told her he had rebuilt his company not for success but to prove to himself he could. As dusk fell, they reached the edge of the cliffs, where the sky bled crimson over the water. She turned to him, eyes reflecting the light. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if what we call love is just memory, trying to find its way home?" He considered the question, the air between them trembling with its weight. "If it is," he said, "then I think I've been lost for a very long time." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Then maybe this isn't home, Elias. Maybe it's just another stop along the way." Before he could answer, thunder cracked across the horizon. Rain began to fall, sharp, cold, relentless. They ran for shelter beneath an old stone archway by the shore. The storm intensified, the waves rising higher, fierce and alive. And then, in the flash of lightning, he saw it, the cliffs beginning to crumble where they had stood moments earlier. The sea had taken another piece of the land. She looked at the ruins, eyes wide. "It's all disappearing," she whispered. "Maybe that's the point," he said. "To let go of what can't stay." The rain softened, turning to mist. She reached for his hand again, this time holding it. "If we keep chasing what burns, Elias, one day there'll be nothing left to save." He looked at her, and for the first time, didn't have an answer. That night, they stayed in silence by a small fire in a nearby cabin. The rain whispered against the roof, steady and endless. She painted while he watched, her strokes slower now, deliberate, no longer wild but full of peace. He realized she was painting not the storm, not the cliffs, but him, not as the man of glass towers, but as he was now, worn, human, unguarded. When she finished, she stepped back, studying it. "You look free," she said. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I am." She turned to the fire, her expression softening. "Then promise me something. If I disappear again, don't come looking." He stared at her, confused. "Why would you say that?" "Because sometimes, the ending isn't loss," she said. "It's release." The words lingered long after the fire died. When morning came, she was gone. The easel stood empty, the painting still drying by the window. But something was different this time. On the back of the canvas, she had written a single line. "When the fire finds the sea, it doesn't die. It transforms." Elias stepped outside, the air heavy with fog and salt. The world felt unfamiliar again, yet alive. For the first time, he wondered if this was never a love story about finding someone else, but about finding the parts of himself he'd buried beneath control, beneath fear, beneath silence. And as the sea stretched endlessly before him, the realization struck with quiet force. He hadn't lost her. He had finally learned how to see her not as a person to hold, but as the fire that had taught him how to feel. But far down the shoreline, just visible through the mist, a shadow moved slow, deliberate, watching, and in that instant, the question returned, sharp as ever: had he truly found peace, or had the story only just begun again? The shadow in the mist didn't move at first. It stood at the edge of the shoreline, indistinct against the pale morning fog, like a shape the sea itself had imagined and forgotten. Elias froze. For a moment he wondered if it was only his mind conjuring ghosts again. But then it shifted, a slow, deliberate motion, almost human. He stepped closer to the water, the gravel crunching under his boots. The air was sharp, metallic lilac. He called out. His voice broke the stillness like a stone dropped into glass. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move away, following the curve of the shore toward the cliffs. Elias followed. The mist thickened around him, swallowing sound, color, distance. Each step felt heavier, as though the ground were testing him. He could hear only the rhythm of his own breathing, the crash of waves below, and the faint whisper of fabric ahead, a coat, a dress, something shifting through the fog. When he reached the base of the cliffs, the figure stopped. He saw her then, faintly, hair unbound, dress billowing in the wind. But something was wrong. She wasn't facing him. She was staring out to sea, motionless, her silhouettes trembling in the cold. "Leela," he said again. softer this time, as if afraid the word itself might break her. She turned slowly. It was her, but her eyes held something distant, like she was seeing a place he couldn't reach. She looked older, thinner, as though time had been feeding on her silence. "You shouldn't have come back," she said. He stopped a few paces away. "You knew I would." She gave a faint, broken laugh. "That's what I was afraid of." The wind howled between them, flinging salt against their skin. The sea below raged, hammering the cliffs with white fury. "I read your message," he said. "You said when the fire finds the sea, it transforms," she finished for him. "I remember." He searched her face, trying to understand the emptiness there. "What does it mean, Leela? Why are you running again?" She turned back toward the horizon, her voice low. "Because some things shouldn't be found twice, Elias, not by the same person." He stepped closer. "You think what we had was a mistake?" "No," she said. "It was a mirror. You looked into me and saw the man you wanted to be. And I looked into you and saw the fire I'd been trying to kill." The words hit him like a wave. "You make it sound like we were just reflections, weren't we?" she asked, meeting his eyes now. "Steady, sorrowful, everything we built came from loneliness, from need. It wasn't love. It was survival disguised as something beautiful." He shook his head. "You don't believe that?" Her voice trembled. "I want to." The tide surged closer, licking at their feet. He could smell rain coming again, that same restless storm that always seemed to follow them. "Why now?" he asked. "Why bring me here? Why leave clues if you didn't want to be found?" She hesitated. "Because I wanted to know if you'd changed. If you could let go of you. Of control. Of the idea that you can fix what's meant to break." He stared at her, his pulse pounding. "And if I can't, then the fire never ends," she whispered. Thunder rolled far out to sea. The sky dimmed. For a moment, neither moved. The silence between them was the kind that feels alive, full of something waiting to collapse. Finally, she said, "There's something you don't know." Her tone shifted, no longer soft, but steady, almost resigned. "Before I left the city, before I disappeared, I sold your painting." He frowned. "What? The first one?" "The one I left behind in the tower. Cold turns to fire. It's not yours anymore. Someone bought it. Someone who wanted it badly enough to pay more than I thought possible." He took a step back, the world tilting slightly. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because they didn't buy it for art," she said. "They bought it for what was hidden underneath." He stared at her, not understanding. "Hidden?" She nodded. "You didn't know. But that night, the storm, when my studio flooded, I used one of your old company canvases, the kind with internal files embedded for tracking, coded with client data. I didn't realize it until after I'd painted over it. Whoever owns that painting now owns more than either of us ever meant to give." The wind tore at them, scattering her words into the roar of the sea. "But he caught everyone who has it?" He asked. "I don't know," she said. "The dealer who handled the sale was anonymous. The money went through layers. I tried to find out, but every lead vanished." Elias turned away, his mind racing. "That data, if it's the same system from my files, it could expose everything." She finished. The storm broke then. Rain lashed across the cliffs in sheets, cold and furious. The sky was a black wound, the waves below a mirror of chaos. Elias looked at her, the weight of understanding settling like stone. "This isn't just about us anymore," he said. She shook her head. "It never was." They stood there, the rain drenching them, their words dissolving into the storm. He moved closer until he was only inches from her. "Then we find it," he said. Together she looked up at him, her face pale against the dark. "And what happens when we do?" He hesitated, his voice low. "Then maybe we finally know what all this was for." A flicker of something, hope, fear. Maybe both crossed her eyes. "You really think the past will let us go that easily?" He almost smiled. "It never has." Lightning split the sky, so bright it turned the sea white. She flinched, and for an instant, he saw her as he had that first morning in the glass tower, defiant, fragile, unknowable. Then she whispered, "There's one more thing you need to see." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, soaked from the rain. She pressed it into his hand. "I got this 3 days ago," she said. "No name, no address, just your initials on the seal." He tore it open. Inside was a photograph, grainy, faded, the painting, Cold Turns to Fire. Only now it was hanging on the wall of a place he recognized immediately. His old office, the top floor of the tower he had abandoned. He stared at it in disbelief. "That's impossible. The board sold everything months ago. Someone bought it back," she said. "Someone who wants you to find it." Lightning flashed again, closer this time. Elias folded the photograph, his hand shaking. "Then we go back." She looked past him, toward the cliffs that led inland, where the faint outline of a road shimmered in the storm. "If we do," she said, "we can't pretend this is about redemption." He met her gaze. "It's not. It's about truth." Her lips parted as if to answer, but a deafening crack of thunder drowned her voice. The sea surged higher, slamming against the rocks. A section of the cliff gave way, collapsing into the waves below. "Go!" he shouted, grabbing her arm as the ground shook beneath them. They ran, the wind ripping at their coats, rain slicing across their faces. The path ahead blurred with mud and water. Every step was a battle against gravity and the storm itself. When they finally reached the road, breathless and soaked, she turned to him, her eyes, wild and shining in the dark. Searched his Elias, she said. If we go back there, everything you've built will come undone. He looked at her, rain dripping from his hair, his jaw set. Then maybe it's time to let it fall. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. In the distance, lightning illuminated the road leading toward the city, slick and endless, like a vein of light cutting through the dark. They stood side by side, both trembling, both changed. The storm raged around them, and in that chaos, a strange clarity emerged to souls who had tried to escape their past, now realizing they were walking straight into its center. The wind carried the scent of salt and iron. The horizon pulsed with a faint glow, not dawn, but something burning far away. And as they stepped onto the road, silent but resolute, neither of them noticed the black car parked beyond the bend, headlights dimmed, watching. A shadow moved inside, the glow of a cigarette briefly revealing a face, calm, patient, waiting. The figure flicked the cigarette into the rain and whispered to no one. They took the bait. Then the car engine roared to life. Taillights vanishing into the storm, leaving only the road, the rain, and the promise that nothing ahead would be the same again. The sea behind them swallowed the cliffs in thunder, and for the first time, Elias felt the weight of destiny pressing down, not as a choice, but as an inevitability. He didn't speak, neither did she. The sound of the waves faded as they walked toward the city lights, toward the truth waiting behind glass walls and painted lies. And as the rain eased, the world held its breath. Just before everything was about to break, the city rose out of the rain like a memory, refusing to fade. Glass towers shimmered in the night, their reflections fractured by puddles on the asphalt. The storm had passed, but the streets still glistened, steam rising from manholes like ghosts rising from old wounds. Elias and Leela walked in silence, their steps echoing against the empty boulevard. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to explain, only the weight of what waited above them, in the tower that had once been his kingdom. The building loomed at the end of the street, black and gleaming, its upper floors lost in fog. Most of the lights were out, but one glowed faintly near the top, his old office. The same room that had birthed both his empire and his undoing. Lila stopped, staring up. You feel it too, she whispered. He nodded, like the past never left. Inside, the lobby was deserted. Their footsteps on the marble sounded too loud, like intruders in a church. The air smelled faintly of dust and electricity. Every corner held a memory, the cold precision of his early mornings. The sound of a voice once echoing through these halls when they still spoke in half-truths and restraint. They stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, their reflections multiplied in the mirrored walls, two strangers bound by fire and history. The numbers climbed slowly, 27, 34, 41. Each floor another heartbeat closer to the truth. At the 52nd floor, the elevator stopped. The doors opened with a sigh. His office looked almost untouched. The desk where he once planned entire futures still stood near the window. The view, that same endless cityscape, stretched into darkness, but there, illuminated by a single light, was the painting. Cold turns to fire. It hung exactly where it shouldn't, centered, framed in gold, immaculate. The colors had deepened over time. The reds seemed alive, shifting with the reflection of the city lights. Elias approached slowly. Lila stayed behind, her breath catching as she stared at her own creation reborn. Someone wanted us here, he said quietly. They wanted this moment. Before she could answer, a voice came from the doorway. Finally they turned. A man stepped forward, sharp suit, calm eyes, the faintest trace of a smile. Elias recognized him instantly. Adrian Cole, his former partner. The man who'd once shared his ambitions before betrayal split the empire in two. Adrian, Elias said, his tone measured. You bought it. Adrian's smile deepened. Not just the painting. The story, too. The rise, the fall, the redemption arc. It's poetic, really. But I needed more than art. I needed access. Lila moved slightly in front of Elias, instinctively. You're the one who knew about the data, she said. Adrian nodded. Your brushstrokes hid more than beauty. Beneath that canvas lies the last encrypted server key from the company, the one Elias swore was destroyed. You painted over the only thing that could expose everything. Elias felt a slow chill climb his spine. Expose what? Adrian's voice softened, almost regretful. The truth. The empire wasn't built on clean hands. Elias, you and I both know that. Those early contracts, the manipulations, the leverage, I just happened to keep the receipts. The room went quiet except for the distant hum of the city below. Lila spoke first. You're trying to destroy him. Adrian's gaze flicked to her. No, I am trying to finish what he started. Burn it all down so something honest can grow in the ashes. He stepped closer, his tone sharpening. You thought walking away absolved you, Elias, but the world doesn't forgive silence. That painting is proof of how deep the fire ran. Elias stared at the canvas. The red seemed to pulse now, as if the painting itself was alive, listening. And if I refuse to give it to you, Adrian's smile returned. Thin, dangerous, you won't. Because you re-still the man who can T-watch something burn, unless he is the one holding the match. The words landed with the weight of truth. Lila stepped between them. Enough, she said. Her voice trembled, but her eyes didn't. You both built this chaos. You used people. You used each other. But this, she gestured toward the painting, this is mine. And if it's going to burn, it'll burn by my hand. Adrian tilted his head. Then do it. For a long moment, no one moved. The air felt heavy with static, as if lightning waited in the walls. Then Lila turned to Elias. Her expression was unreadable. Do you want to know the truth? She asked softly. He hesitated. About what? About why I painted it. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It wasn't for you. It wasn't for me. It was for what stood between us. The thing neither of us would admit existed, fear. You tried to master everything because you were afraid of losing control, and I ran because I was afraid of being seen. That painting wasn't love. It was a confession. Elias felt the words cut deep, but not cruelly, cleanly, like truth finally freed from silence. Adrian watched them both, silent now, his plan unraveling into something he couldn't manipulate. Lila stepped closer to the canvas, her hand trembling as she touched the edge. Under this layer, she said, is everything you hid. The numbers, the secrets, the lies. But there's something else too. She looked at Elias. I left a second layer, a message, a truth only you would understand. Before either man could stop her, she picked up a palette knife from the nearby desk and sliced through the canvas. The sound was soft but final, fabric tearing, paint cracking. The golden frame tilted, the painting collapsing into two halves. Beneath the surface, faint lines of code shimmered under the light, data, encrypted and real, but carved into the layer below, written in her small, uneven handwriting, were 5 words. You were the fire all along. The room fell silent. Elias stared at the words, unable to breathe. The truth hit not as a revelation but as recognition. Something he'd known deep down but refused to name. All his life, he'd built walls to keep the chaos out, never realizing the chaos lived within him. The cold wasn't protection, it was denial. Adrian stepped forward, breaking the moment. Beautiful, he said. Tragic but beautiful, and now it's mine. He reached for the torn painting, but Elias moved faster, grabbing his arm and slamming him against the wall. Years of restraint broke all at once, not rage but clarity. This ends here, Elias said quietly. No more control, no more fear. Adrian struggled, his smirk fading. You can't stop what's coming. Elias looked past him, toward the torn canvas and the city beyond the glass. I don't want to. Maybe it's time it all comes out. He let Adrian go. The man stumbled, straightened his jacket and gave a small, mocking bow. Then you've finally learned how to burn properly. He left without another word, his footsteps fading into the hall. Lila stood by the window, her silhouette outlined by the trembling city lights. You meant it, didn't you? She said softly. You're going to let it fall. Elias joined her, looking out at the skyline that had once been his empire. It was never mine, he said. It belonged to everything I was afraid to face. She turned to him, eyes glistening. So what happens now? He looked at the torn painting on the floor. The code glowed faintly, lines of data flickering like embers ready to die out. Now, he said, we stop pretending this fire ever needed control. He picked up the 2 halves, laid them gently on the desk, and lit the corner with his lighter. The flame caught slowly, spreading across the canvas with a quiet hunger. The reds came alive one last time, dancing in the air before collapsing into ash. Lila watched silently, tears mixing with the reflection of fire in her eyes. You're destroying everything, she whispered. No, he said. I'm freeing it. The fire spread to the papers on the desk, then to the drapes by the window. Smoke began to curl toward the ceiling. The alarms stayed silent. Someone had disabled them long ago. Elias, she said, fear creeping into her voice. We have to go. He turned to her. Go, I'll follow. But she shook her head. Not without you. For a moment they stood surrounded by flame and memory. The heat building, the world narrowing to just the 2 of them. He looked at her, really looked at the woman who had been his mirror, his chaos, his cure. You were right, he said. Passion burns, but it also cleanses. She stepped closer, took his hand. Then let's burn clean. Together they moved toward the door. Behind them, the painting collapsed entirely, its ashes rising into the air like dark snow. They reached the elevator as the fire roared behind them. The doors closed, sealing the past in smoke and light. Neither spoke as they descended. The only sound was the hum of the elevator and their breathing. Steady, human, alive. When the doors opened to the street, the cold air hit them like rebirth. Firelight flickered high above, reflected in the glass of other towers. Sirens began to wail somewhere in the distance. Lila looked back once. It's really gone, she said. Elias nodded. Everything that needed to be. She studied him, the calm in his face, the stillness where once there had been only calculation. So this is it, the end. He looked out over the wet city, smoke curling into the dawn. No, he said quietly, just the moment before it. For a long time they stood in silence. The storm had washed the streets clean. The air smelled of rain and smoke and something else, renewal, maybe. In the faint light of morning, she reached for his hand again. He didn't pull away this time. Above them, The tower burned quietly against the gray sky, a monument to everything they'd been, and everything they'd finally let go of. And somewhere inside that falling silence, a new truth began to take shape, not made of fire or fear, but of something gentler, unnamed, and waiting. The sirens grew louder. The sky turned pale gold, and as they walked away, the city began to wake, unaware that, for two people who had built and destroyed everything, the fire had finally become light. But in the far distance, beyond the smoke, another reflection flickered, a shadow watching from the window of a nearby building, unseen. And in that reflection, a faint whisper, "Every fire leaves an ember." The sound vanished with the wind, and the story, for the first time, began to breathe. The sun rose over the city like it was unsure it should. A pale light bled through the fog, soft and hesitant, touching the wet glass towers that still shimmered with a memory of smoke. The fire from the night before had burned itself out quietly, leaving behind only the faint scent of ash and the echo of sirens long since faded. Elias stood on the edge of the river where the water met the morning, hands in his pockets, eyes unfocused. The city hummed faintly behind him, not with chaos, but with the slow pulse of return. Workers sweeping sidewalks, distant voices calling for taxis. The living world, indifferent to the stories it consumes and forgets. Leela was sitting a few feet away, sketchbook balanced on her knees. The pages fluttered in the wind. Her pencil moved softly, tracing something unseen. Neither spoke. There was no need to. The silence between them felt different now, not heavy, not waiting to be broken, just old. He watched the reflection of the towers in the water, their inverted shapes rippling like fragile truths. It was strange, he thought, how quickly something so monumental could become a shadow. The building that once ruled his life was now just a burnt-out shape in the skyline. The empire that had defined him reduced to whispers and headlines, but for the first time, he didn't feel the ache of loss. He felt relief. "Do you think they'll understand?" Leela asked quietly, without looking up. Elias turned slightly. "Who? Anyone? The people who'll talk about it. The ones who'll try to make sense of what happened." He smiled faintly. "They'll turn it into something simple. They always do. Success, betrayal, love gone wrong, maybe even redemption, if they're feeling generous." She nodded, eyes still on her drawing. "Stories like clean edges. But life doesn't have them," he said. "No," she whispered. "It only has beginnings that pretend to be endings." The river glimmered under the growing light. Somewhere far downstream, a siren wailed faintly and then vanished. The day was unfolding, cautious, quiet, unaware of the ghosts it carried. Lila closed her sketchbook and set it beside her. "I didn't think it would end like this," she said. Elias looked at her, studying the face that had once been a storm and now seemed impossibly calm. "Neither did I, but maybe this isn't an ending." "What is it then?" He looked at the river again. "A return to something real." She tilted her head, almost smiling. "You always spoke like an architect, even when you weren't building anything." "Maybe I was," he said. "Just not the right things." A small silence passed between them, not uncomfortable, but fragile, as if the world were pausing to listen. Lila picked up a stone and tossed it into the water. Ripples spread outward, distorting the reflection of the city. "When I left," she said, "I thought distance would heal everything. That if I got far enough away, the noise would stop. Did it?" She shook her head. "The noise was never out there." He nodded slowly. "It never is." The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of burnt metal from somewhere upriver. It mixed with the smell of morning coffee from a nearby cafe and the salt of the river's edge. The city was waking up, stretching, pretending nothing had changed, but something had. Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, a half-melted fragment of the painting's frame. Gold leaf still clung to the edge, warped but beautiful. He turned it over in his hand, watching it catch the light. "This," he said softly, "used to mean control. Proof that I'd built something that would last." Lila watched him, and now, he smiled faintly. "Now it's proof that nothing was ever mine to keep." She looked down at the fragment, then at him. "Maybe that's what makes it real," she said. "The fact that it ends." He nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Maybe." For a while they sat like that, two figures framed by the morning, the river gliding past as though carrying their silence with it. Then, slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph, the one that had brought them back. It was creased and damp, edges frayed from rain. The painting hung there still, eternal in print, even as its real form turned to ash. She tore it in half. The sound was soft, almost tender. She handed one piece to him. "For what was," she said. He took it, then looked at her. "And for what's next?" She smiled. "That one we paint without rules." The wind caught the torn halves and lifted them slightly before they fell into the river, where they floated for a moment, then sank, disappearing into the dark beneath the light. They watched until the last ripple vanished. Elias spoke quietly. "Do you ever think we were wrong? To let it all burn?" Leela's voice was calm. "Maybe, but wrong doesn't always mean regret." He thought about that, about how many decisions in his life had been built on fear disguised as logic, how every choice had been a calculation until the fire forced him to feel instead of control. For the first time, he felt the quiet, not as emptiness but as space. "Adrian won't stop," he said eventually. "You know that, right?" Leela nodded. He'll build something new from what's left. People like him always do. And us, we rebuild differently. He looked at her, how she stood, brushing dust from her coat, by not mistaking creation for possession. He smiled at that, not because he fully understood, but because he wanted to. They began walking along the river, side by side, the city sprawling before them. The light grew warmer, touching their faces, revealing how tired they both were, and how alive. They passed a group of workers unloading scaffolding near a construction site. The smell of fresh concrete and sawdust filled the air. Elias slowed for a moment, watching. There was something about it. The sound of hammers, the rhythm of renewal that stirred something deep within him. Lila noticed. Thinking of building again. He shook his head. Not towers, she smiled. Then what? He didn't answer right away. He just looked at the rising sun reflected in the steel framework ahead. Something that breathes, he said finally. Something that doesn't need to outlast us to matter. They crossed a bridge, the wind stronger there. Cars moved below like veins of light. Above them, pigeons spiraled in lazy circles. The city felt new again, not because it had changed, but because they had. When they reached the other side, Lila stopped. I'll be leaving soon, she said. There's a residency in Lisbon, a chance to start over. He turned to her, searching her face for hesitation. And if I asked you to stay? She met his eyes. Would you be asking for me, or for what we used to be? He hesitated, then smiled, a small, genuine thing. Then go, he said. But don't disappear this time. She stepped closer, touched his hand briefly, the briefest connection, but it held everything unsaid. Some fires, she whispered, are meant to light different rooms. Then she walked away, the wind tugging at her coat, her figure fading into the brightness of the waking day. Elias watched her until she was gone. Then he turned toward the river again. The water shimmered gold. Now the city's reflection looked almost peaceful, no longer fractured. He stood there a long while, until the noise of life began to fill the air again. Footsteps, laughter, the world resuming its rhythm. And for the first time in years, he felt small in the best possible way. He thought of everything they had broken, everything they had burned, and realized that perhaps destruction wasn't the opposite of creation, but its beginning. That maybe love, real love, wasn't about keeping something whole, but about having the courage to let it transform. He pulled the melted fragment from his pocket once more, held it up to the sunlight, and for a brief moment it caught the light in such a way that it seemed to glow. Then he let it fall into the river. The current took it gently, carrying it away until it was indistinguishable from the ripples. He exhaled. The sound was barely a breath. As he turned to leave, the wind picked up again, playful, alive. It moved through the streets like a whisper of what had been and what might still come. He walked without hurry, blending into the rhythm of the morning crowd. Somewhere far above, the sun broke fully through the haze, washing the city in gold. And in that light, the past looked almost merciful. He thought of her last words, and smiled, not with sadness, but with understanding. Every fire leaves an ember. The question, he realized, isn't whether it burns again. It's whether we learn how to carry its warmth without letting it consume us. The city breathed, the river moved, the world went on. And in the quiet between two heartbeats, the story that began as a cold agreement and burned into passion finally became what it was always meant to be. Not an ending, but the faint, steady glow of something lasting, just beyond words. The camera would have lingered on the river then, catching the shimmer of light across its surface. The frame would fade slowly, the sound of wind mixing with the hum of the waking city. And as the screen dissolved into quiet, only one question would remain, soft, lingering, unspoken. When everything you've built turns to fire, what do you choose to save? The ashes, or the light they leave behind?